In March 1945, Tokyo Rose broadcast to American troops in the Pacific. Her voice was sultry and seductive. Her message was designed to demoralize. Her music was the best American jazz available. "Hello, boys," she purred over the airwaves. "This is your favorite enemy, Tokyo Rose, coming to you from Radio Tokyo. While you're out here in the jungle dying for nothing, your girlfriends back home are dancing with 4F draft dodgers. Your wives are lonely, your jobs are gone, and you're going to die on some worthless island nobody's ever heard of." Then she played Glenn Miller, or Benny Goodman, or Frank Sinatra. The Japanese military believed this would destroy American morale. They were certain homesick soldiers would hear the broadcast and lose the will to fight. They thought reminding Americans of home would make them desert. They were catastrophically wrong. American troops loved Tokyo Rose. They gathered around radios to listen to her broadcasts. They requested her show specifically. They wrote fan mail, not because they believed her propaganda, but because she played the best music in the Pacific, because she was entertaining, because she reminded them of home in a way that strengthened resolve rather than weakening it. Tokyo Rose became a morale booster for American troops. The propaganda designed to break them became the highlight of their day. Japanese psychological warfare had backfired completely. But Tokyo Rose was just one example. Japan's entire propaganda apparatus suffered from a fundamental flaw. They created propaganda based on Japanese psychology. But it was aimed at Americans who thought completely differently. The result was a propaganda campaign that achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Messages designed to frighten emboldened. Broadcasts designed to demoralize entertained. Threats designed to intimidate were laughed at. This is the story of how Japan's propaganda war failed, how cultural misunderstanding turned psychological warfare into comedy, how the Japanese military never understood the enemy they were trying to demoralize, and how their own propaganda ultimately damaged Japanese morale more than American morale. Historical context: the propaganda machines. Both Japan and America understood that modern war was fought on multiple fronts: military operations, industrial production, and psychological warfare. Controlling the narrative mattered. If your population believed the war was just and winnable, they would endure hardships. If your enemy believed the war was hopeless, they might surrender without fighting. Propaganda became a weapon as important as bombs. Japan's propaganda machine was sophisticated and well-funded. The Information Bureau coordinated domestic propaganda. The Broadcasting Corporation of Japan controlled radio. The Army and Navy maintained separate propaganda departments. Multiple agencies competed to shape both domestic and international narratives. The system was centralized and hierarchical. The government controlled all media: newspapers, radio, films. All were subject to strict censorship. Nothing critical of the government or military could be published. Everything reinforced the official narrative. That narrative had several key elements. Japan was invincible and divinely protected. The emperor was sacred and infallible. Death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. Western nations were decadent and weak. Victory was inevitable. This narrative was reinforced constantly through every media channel. Children learned it in schools. Adults heard it on radio. Everyone saw it in newsreels and films. The propaganda was effective domestically. Most Japanese civilians believed the official narrative completely. They believed Japan was winning, even when it was clearly losing. They believed American forces were incompetent, even as American forces advanced across the Pacific. They believed divine wind would save Japan, even as American bombers destroyed Japanese cities. But external propaganda, propaganda aimed at enemies, was much less successful. The problem was fundamental. Japanese propaganda was created by Japanese people, for Japanese people, based on Japanese psychology. When aimed at Americans, it completely missed the mark. American propaganda operated differently. The Office of War Information coordinated messaging. But American culture was less centralized and more commercially driven. Hollywood studios produced war films. Radio networks broadcast news and entertainment. Newspapers competed for readers. The American propaganda narrative was more flexible. America fights for freedom and democracy. The enemy is evil and must be defeated. American industrial might guarantees victory. Sacrifice now ensures peace later. Unity and determination will win the war. But American propaganda also incorporated doubt and realism. Films showed American casualties. Radio broadcasts acknowledged setbacks. Newspapers reported losses honestly. This created credibility. When the government said something positive, people believed it because the government also acknowledged negatives. The propaganda worked because it wasn't obviously propaganda. Japanese propaganda lacked this credibility. It never acknowledged defeats. It exaggerated victories. It made claims that were obviously false. This worked domestically because Japanese citizens had no alternative information sources. But it failed internationally because foreign audiences could compare Japanese claims to reality. The contrast became absurd during the Battle of Midway. Japan suffered a catastrophic defeat. 4 carriers sunk. Hundreds of pilots killed. Japanese propaganda announced a great victory. American newspapers reported Japan's defeat accurately. Americans could see that Japanese propaganda was lying. This undermined every subsequent Japanese propaganda claim. Why believe anything Tokyo said when they lied about obvious defeats? But the Japanese military didn't understand this problem. They believed propaganda worked through repetition and authority. They believed if they said something often enough and officially enough, people would believe it. This might have been true for Japanese citizens conditioned to trust authority. But it was completely ineffective against Americans conditioned to question authority. The cultural disconnect created opportunities for propaganda backfire. Japanese propagandists made assumptions about American psychology that were completely wrong. They created messages they thought would demoralize Americans. Those messages had the opposite effect. Technical analysis: the psychology of propaganda failure. Tokyo Rose was the most famous example of backfired propaganda. But Tokyo Rose wasn't a person. It was a role played by multiple women. The most famous was Eva Toguri Dakino, an American citizen of Japanese descent, trapped in Japan when the war started. Toguri was coerced into broadcasting propaganda. The Japanese military believed her American accent would make the broadcasts more credible. They wrote scripts designed to demoralize American troops. The scripts followed a consistent formula: remind soldiers of home and what they're missing. Emphasize that the war is pointless and they'll die for nothing. Suggest their loved ones are being unfaithful. Claim Japan is winning and American defeat is inevitable. Play American music to reinforce homesickness. Japanese psychologists believed this would work because of how Japanese soldiers would respond. Japanese military culture emphasized that thinking about home was weakness. Japanese soldiers were expected to sever emotional ties to families. Letters from home were sometimes withheld to prevent emotional distractions. Reminding Japanese soldiers of home and family would undermine their fighting spirit. The Japanese military assumed American soldiers operated under the same psychology. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. American military culture was completely different. American soldiers were encouraged to think about home. They received regular mail from families. They displayed photos of wives, girlfriends, and children. Home and family were central to why they were fighting. American soldiers weren't fighting for abstract concepts like honor or empire. They were fighting to protect their loved ones and way of life. Reminding them of what they were defending increased motivation rather than undermining it. When Tokyo Rose said, "Your girlfriend is back home dancing," American troops thought, "Right, and I'm fighting so she can dance safely instead of being conquered by Japan." The propaganda reinforced their purpose rather than undermining it. The music selection backfired even more spectacularly. Japanese propagandists selected American jazz, swing, and popular music. They believed this music would make troops unbearably homesick. In the isolated Pacific Islands with no entertainment, homesickness would become depression and defeatism. But American troops were starved for any entertainment. Combat zones offered nothing. No movies, no concerts, no radio shows. Just endless jungle, heat, disease, and occasional combat. Tokyo Rose broadcasts became the only source of quality entertainment. American troops would gather around radios specifically to hear the music. They ignored the propaganda entirely and enjoyed the music. The broadcasts became morale boosters rather than morale destroyers. After listening to Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman, troops felt better, not worse. The music reminded them of home in a positive way. It gave them hope that they'd return to that world. One American soldier wrote in his diary, "We listen to Tokyo Rose every night. The propaganda is hilarious. She tells us we're losing when we can see we're advancing. But the music is great. It's the only decent entertainment out here. Japanese propaganda is keeping our spirits up. I wonder if they realize they're helping us." Japanese military intelligence received reports that American troops listened to Tokyo Rose broadcasts regularly. They interpreted this as evidence of propaganda effectiveness. They assumed high listening rates meant the propaganda was working. They never understood that troops were listening for the music, not the message. They never grasped that the propaganda was being mocked and ignored. This misunderstanding led to increased investment in Tokyo Rose-style broadcasts. More resources were allocated. More broadcasts were scheduled. More propaganda was written. All of it was being laughed at by American troops who just wanted to hear Frank Sinatra. Toguri herself understood this and actively worked to sabotage her broadcasts. She would read propaganda scripts in exaggerated, sarcastic tones. She would deliberately mispronounce words to make the propaganda ridiculous. She would add improvised comments that undermined the official message. Example, scripted propaganda. "American boys, your country has abandoned you. You will die on these islands for nothing. Your sacrifices are meaningless. Surrender now, and Japan will treat you well." Toguri's actual delivery: "American boys, your country has allegedly abandoned you. At least that's what this script says. You'll die on these islands for nothing, or so Tokyo believes. Your sacrifices are allegedly meaningless. Surrender now, and Japan will supposedly treat you well. Sure they will, boys. Now, here's some Artie Shaw to brighten your day." The sarcasm was obvious to English speakers. American troops understood she was mocking the propaganda even while reading it. This made them like her even more. Japanese military censors didn't catch the subversion. Their English wasn't fluent enough to detect sarcasm. They heard her reading the scripts and assumed she was delivering them sincerely. The entire operation was a propaganda disaster that Japanese leadership interpreted as success. But Tokyo Rose wasn't the only backfired propaganda effort. Leaflets were another catastrophic failure. Japan dropped millions of propaganda leaflets on Allied positions throughout the Pacific. The leaflets were professionally designed with color illustrations and carefully crafted text. Significant resources were invested in design, printing, and distribution. One series featured illustrations of attractive women with American men in civilian clothes. The men were clearly draft dodgers, healthy young men not in uniform. The women were posed suggestively with these men. The text read, "While you fight and die in the jungle, she's with him back home. He's safe, comfortable, and with your girl. You're here dying for nothing. Surrender now and survive." The Japanese military believed this would create overwhelming jealousy and resentment. American soldiers would become so angry about girlfriends potentially cheating that they'd lose the will to fight. Some might even surrender to escape the psychological torture. American troops did collect these leaflets in large quantities. Japanese intelligence received reports of widespread leaflet collection. They interpreted this as success. The propaganda was being read and saved. But the leaflets were being collected for a completely different reason. The paper quality was excellent, much better than the rough paper available to troops. The leaflets were being used as toilet paper. American troops joked about this constantly. "Hey, we're out of Japanese propaganda. Anyone got more?" "This leaflet works great. The image of my girlfriend with another guy really helps me. Wipe." The mockery was comprehensive and gleeful. Japanese resources were being spent producing bathroom supplies for American troops. One creative American unit created a Japanese leaflet latrine. They posted the leaflets on the walls of their field latrine. The images of women and propaganda messages became bathroom decoration. Photos of this latrine were sent home and published in newspapers. Japanese intelligence never understood what was happening. They received reports. "American troops are collecting and posting our leaflets extensively." They concluded, "The propaganda campaign is highly successful. Continue and expand production." More leaflets were printed and dropped. More leaflets became toilet paper. The backfire was complete, but invisible to those creating the propaganda. Another leaflet series showed graphic images of wounded and dead soldiers. The images were medical photographs showing horrific injuries. The text warned, "This will be you. Surrender now and live. Die fighting and rot in the jungle." The intent was to frighten troops into surrender through fear of death and mutilation. This might have worked on troops who had never seen combat, but by the time troops encountered these leaflets, they'd already experienced combat. They'd already seen wounded friends. They'd already seen dead bodies. They'd already experienced the reality of war. The photographs couldn't match what they'd already witnessed. The propaganda was less disturbing than their actual lived experience. Moreover, the photographs were obviously posed medical images. They didn't look like combat casualties. They looked like surgery demonstrations. This reduced their psychological impact further. American troops found the images darkly amusing rather than frightening. "Look, Tokyo thinks this will scare us. We saw worse yesterday. These photos are so fake. Actual combat wounds look way worse." The surrender appeals were particularly counterproductive. Japanese propaganda promised good treatment for prisoners of war. Leaflets claimed, "Surrender and you will be fed, housed and treated with respect according to international law." But American intelligence had briefed troops extensively on actual Japanese treatment of prisoners. The Bataan Death March, routine executions of prisoners, torture and medical experimentation, starvation and disease in prison camps. Troops knew that surrendering to Japanese forces meant probable death. The propaganda promising good treatment was so obviously false that it destroyed all credibility. If Japanese propaganda lied about prisoner treatment, why believe anything else they claimed? American troops began creating parody leaflets mocking Japanese propaganda. They would use captured Japanese leaflets as templates. They'd copy the design but change the text to jokes. One parody leaflet showed the same image of a woman with a draft dodger. The modified text read, "While you fight here, your girl is probably eating better food than we are. Lucky her. At least someone in your family isn't eating canned rations. Fight on, so she can keep enjoying those privileges." These parodies circulated among American units as entertainment. They were more popular than official American propaganda. The creativity and humor boosted morale more effectively than any official message. Radio broadcasts beyond Tokyo Rose also backfired systematically. Japanese propaganda radio featured news programs reporting Japanese victories and American defeats. These broadcasts claimed American aircraft carriers sunk, including carriers still actively operating. American aircraft destroyed in numbers exceeding total production. American cities bombed, attacks that never occurred. American morale collapsing, contradicted by observable American behavior. American industrial production failing when it was obviously increasing. American troops with access to actual news could compare Japanese claims to reality. The discrepancy was so enormous that Japanese radio became unintentional comedy. Units would gather to listen to Japanese propaganda as entertainment. They'd keep score of absurd claims. "They sunk the Enterprise again. That's the 7th time this month. They destroyed 800 American aircraft yesterday. We only sent 300, and most came back. They say American morale is collapsing. Tell that to the guys who just took another island." The propaganda was so disconnected from reality that it became a form of comedy show. Troops would laugh at the absurd claims. They'd make drinking games around propaganda broadcasts. Take a drink every time Japan claims to sink the Enterprise. Japanese propagandists never understood they were being mocked. They received reports that American troops listened regularly to Japanese radio. They concluded their propaganda was effective. They increased broadcast hours and production values. They hired more announcers and writers. They invested more resources in programming. All of it was being consumed as comedy by American troops. But perhaps the most devastating propaganda backfire involved claims about American industrial capacity. Japanese propaganda consistently claimed American industrial production was low and decreasing. American equipment was inferior and poorly made. American supplies were scarce. American forces were poorly equipped. This propaganda was intended to accomplish two goals: boost Japanese morale by suggesting the enemy was weak, demoralize Americans by suggesting their industrial system was failing. Both goals backfired catastrophically. American troops could directly observe that the propaganda was false. They had more equipment than they needed. Supplies were abundant to the point of waste. New weapons and vehicles arrived constantly. Food was plentiful, far better than what Japanese forces had. The abundance was so extreme that it became a joke among American troops. They threw away or abandoned equipment that Japanese forces would have desperately needed. Damaged vehicles were sometimes left behind rather than repaired. Ammunition was expended freely because resupply was guaranteed. Japanese prisoners who saw American supply depots suffered psychological breaks. The shock was profound and devastating. One Japanese prisoner described his experience. "We were told America was weak and poorly supplied. We believed our officers. When I was captured and saw the American supply depot, I couldn't believe it. Mountains of food. Mountains of ammunition. New vehicles everywhere. They had more supplies in one depot than our entire army had in the Philippines. Everything we'd been told was a lie. If they lied about this, what else was false?" The realization was common among prisoners. Japanese propaganda had created expectations of American weakness. Reality showed overwhelming American strength. The cognitive dissonance shattered belief in Japanese propaganda entirely. This created a cascade of doubt. If propaganda lied about American industrial capacity, was it lying about Japanese victories? If American equipment was superior, not inferior, what did that mean for the war? If American forces were well supplied, not desperate, could Japan actually win? Prisoners began questioning everything they'd been taught. Many became cooperative with American interrogators. Why protect a government that had lied so comprehensively? American interrogators exploited this disillusionment systematically. They would show prisoners supply depots before interrogation. They would provide prisoners with American rations, far better than Japanese rations. They would demonstrate American equipment superiority. Then they'd ask, "Is this what Tokyo told you we had?" The contrast between propaganda and reality broke resistance. Prisoners provided intelligence willingly. Some prisoners expressed relief at being captured. They'd been told Americans executed prisoners. Instead, they received food, medical care, and humane treatment. Everything Japanese propaganda claimed about Americans was revealed as lies. The propaganda designed to sustain Japanese fighting spirit had created false expectations that reality shattered. This applied not just to prisoners, but to Japanese forces still fighting. Japanese soldiers experienced the reality of American material superiority daily. They fought with obsolete equipment, while Americans had the latest technology. They starved, while Americans were well fed. They ran out of ammunition, while Americans fired freely. Every day of combat contradicted Japanese propaganda claims. Every engagement demonstrated that Japanese propaganda was false. The cumulative effect was devastating to morale. If Japanese leadership lied about American weakness, what else were they lying about? If Japan was supposedly winning, why were American forces advancing? If divine protection was real, why were Japanese forces being destroyed? These questions undermined faith in leadership and propaganda simultaneously. The propaganda that was supposed to sustain morale was destroying it through obvious falsehood. By 1945, even Japanese civilians could see the propaganda was false. American bombers flew over Japan unopposed, contradicting claims of strong air defense. Cities burned, contradicting claims that American bombing was ineffective. Food was scarce, contradicting claims of agricultural abundance. Young men died in enormous numbers, contradicting claims of glorious victories with minimal casualties. The disconnect between propaganda and observable reality created a credibility crisis. Citizens stopped believing official announcements. They assumed the opposite of propaganda claims was probably true. When propaganda announced a victory, civilians assumed Japan had lost. When propaganda claimed American forces were weak, civilians assumed they were strong. When propaganda promised victory was near, civilians prepared for defeat. The propaganda apparatus had lost all credibility with the audience it was designed to influence. This was complete and total failure. Worse than simply being ignored, the propaganda had created a reverse effect. It was being used as a reverse indicator of truth. Whatever propaganda claimed, the opposite was likely accurate. This reversed the entire purpose of propaganda. Instead of shaping perception, it was revealing truth through inversion. Instead of sustaining morale, it was destroying it. Instead of building trust in leadership, it was creating cynicism and despair. The propaganda designed to help Japan win the war was helping Japan lose it, through cultural misunderstanding, through false claims easily disproved, through creating expectations that reality destroyed. Every broadcast, every leaflet, every message backfired. Tokyo Rose entertained instead of demoralizing. Leaflets became toilet paper instead of psychological weapons. Radio broadcasts became comedy instead of news. Claims about American weakness became obvious lies. The propaganda war was lost completely, not because Japanese propagandists were incompetent, but because propaganda cannot overcome observable reality, and reality was visible to everyone on all sides. This was the fundamental flaw in Japanese propaganda. It created a narrative that couldn't survive contact with reality. When Japanese soldiers encountered actual American forces, the disconnect was devastating. American soldiers were supposed to be weak and poorly trained. They were actually well-fed, well-equipped, and competent. American equipment was supposed to be inferior. It was actually superior in most categories. American morale was supposed to be fragile. It was actually remarkably resilient. Every Japanese propaganda claim was contradicted by battlefield experience. This undermined not just the propaganda, but trust in Japanese leadership. If they lied about the enemy, were they lying about Japanese victories? If American forces weren't weak, was Japan actually winning? The propaganda backfire extended beyond the military to Japanese civilians. Japanese domestic propaganda claimed Japan was winning the war decisively. American bombing was ineffective. Japanese forces controlled the Pacific. Victory was imminent. But by 1945, Japanese civilians could see reality contradicted propaganda. American bombers flew over Japan unopposed, not ineffective. Cities burned, not under control. Food was scarce, not abundant, as claimed. Young men died in enormous numbers, not achieving glorious victories. The propaganda had promised divine protection. Reality delivered firebombing. The propaganda had promised inevitable victory. Reality delivered steady defeat. The disconnect created a morale crisis worse than if propaganda had been honest. If the government had acknowledged difficulties but promised eventual victory, civilians might have maintained resolve. But the government lied so consistently that when reality became undeniable, the psychological crash was catastrophic. Japanese civilians lost faith in their government. They lost faith in military leadership. They lost faith in the narrative they'd been fed for years. The propaganda designed to sustain morale ultimately destroyed it by creating false expectations that reality shattered, by lying so consistently that truth became revolutionary. American propaganda succeeded where Japanese propaganda failed. American propaganda acknowledged setbacks while maintaining overall optimism. When Americans were told D-Day would be difficult, and it was difficult, the propaganda gained credibility. When Americans were told victory would require sacrifice, and sacrifice led to victory, the propaganda was validated. Japanese propaganda never acknowledged difficulty. Every setback was reported as a victory. Every defeat was hidden. Every loss was denied. This worked temporarily, but reality eventually intrudes. When it did, Japanese propaganda had no credibility left. The backfire was complete. Propaganda designed to strengthen resolve undermined it. Messages intended to demoralize the enemy entertained them. Broadcasts meant to frighten became comedy. Japan's propaganda war was lost, not because the production quality was poor, not because the distribution was inadequate, but because it fundamentally misunderstood the audience and created claims reality could easily disprove. Human impact, the voices behind the broadcasts. Iva Toguri Dakino never wanted to be Tokyo Rose. She was an American citizen born in Los Angeles in 1916. She graduated from UCLA with a degree in zoology. She had no interest in politics or propaganda. She planned to become a doctor or researcher. In July 1941, Toguri traveled to Japan to visit a sick aunt. She planned to return to America within 6 weeks. She had a return ticket. She had her American passport. She expected to resume her life in California. Then Pearl Harbor happened on December 7, 1941. She was suddenly an enemy alien in Japan. Return to America became impossible. She was trapped in enemy territory with no resources. Toguri refused to renounce her American citizenship. Japanese authorities pressured her repeatedly to become a Japanese citizen. They offered food rations and better treatment if she complied. She refused every time. "I am American," she told interrogators. "I will always be American. You can't change that." This defiance made her life in Japan extraordinarily difficult. Without Japanese citizenship, she was denied a food ration card. She was harassed constantly by police who viewed her with suspicion. She faced discrimination in employment and housing. She lived in poverty, often going hungry. To survive, she took menial jobs that didn't require Japanese citizenship. She worked as a typist at a Danish import company. The pay was minimal, but she had few options as a foreign national. In November 1943, she was recruited by Radio Tokyo. Initially, she worked as a typist in the programming department. The job paid slightly better than her previous work. She needed the money to survive. Radio Tokyo employed Allied prisoners of war to produce English-language broadcasts. The POWs were forced to create propaganda against their will. Australian Major Charles Cousins, an experienced radio broadcaster, was one of them. American Army Captain Wallace Ince was another. Filipino broadcaster Norman Reyes completed the team. These POWs needed an English-speaking woman to serve as announcer. Toguri's American accent made her perfect for the role. She was approached in August 1943 to join the broadcast team. She initially refused. "I won't betray my country," she said. But the pressure increased. Japanese officials threatened her. "Cooperate or face consequences. Your family members in Japan will be arrested. You'll be sent to a military internment camp. You might not survive." The threats were credible. Japanese authorities routinely punished families of uncooperative individuals. Toguri had relatives in Japan who could be targeted. She agreed to broadcast, but with a plan. She would appear to cooperate while secretly sabotaging the propaganda. If she had to broadcast, she would make sure the broadcasts failed. The Allied POWs working at Radio Tokyo helped her develop this strategy. Major Cousins became her mentor and co-conspirator. He was an experienced broadcaster who understood propaganda techniques. He taught her how to subvert propaganda while appearing to comply. The techniques were subtle but effective. Use exaggerated delivery that makes claims sound ridiculous. Employ sarcastic tone that signals disbelief in the message. Strategically emphasize absurd elements to highlight their absurdity. Deliberately mispronounce key words to undermine serious claims. Insert ad-lib comments that contradict the scripted propaganda. Cousins also taught her music selection strategy. Choose upbeat, morale-boosting songs instead of melancholic ones. Select music that would make troops feel good, not depressed. The music should counteract the propaganda, not reinforce it. Together, Toguri and the POWs created a coded resistance operation. The broadcasts appeared to be propaganda to Japanese censors, but they were actually designed to fail as propaganda. They were sabotage disguised as cooperation. Toguri's radio program was called 0 Hour. She adopted the on-air persona of Orphan Anne, one of several Tokyo Rose voices. The name Tokyo Rose was created by American troops, not by Japanese propaganda. It became a generic term for any English-speaking woman on Japanese radio. Her broadcasts followed a standard format, open with exaggerated greeting. "Hello, boys, this is your favorite enemy," read propaganda script with obvious sarcasm. play excellent American music, close with more propaganda read in a tone that undermined the message. American troops quickly understood what she was doing. They recognized the sarcasm. They appreciated the good music. They understood she was sabotaging her own broadcasts. One American soldier wrote home in 1944, "We listen to Tokyo Rose every night. She's clearly an American who's being forced to broadcast propaganda, but she makes it so ridiculous that we know she's on our side. The music is great and the propaganda is funny. She's actually helping morale, not hurting it. I hope she survives the war. She's a hero pretending to be a traitor." But Japanese military leadership interpreted the broadcasts completely differently. They received reports of high listening rates among American troops. They concluded the propaganda was working. They never understood that troops were mocking the propaganda and enjoying the music. Toguri continued broadcasting until August 13, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. She had survived the war, maintaining her American citizenship and sabotaging propaganda from within. When American occupation forces arrived, she expected recognition for her resistance. She had maintained loyalty to America under duress. She had sabotaged enemy propaganda at personal risk. She had helped Allied POWs resist their captors. Instead, she was arrested on September 5, 1945. The charge, broadcasting for the enemy. American authorities initially saw her as a traitor, not a saboteur. She was held in Sugamo prison for over a year while authorities investigated. The investigation eventually concluded she had been coerced and had subverted her broadcasts. Allied POWs testified on her behalf. Major Cousins provided detailed testimony about their sabotage operation. Captain Ince confirmed that Toguri had helped them resist. On October 25, 1946, she was released without charges. The evidence clearly showed she hadn't willingly aided the enemy. American authorities concluded prosecution was unwarranted. She married Felipe d'Aquino, a Portuguese citizen, and prepared to return to America. She applied for a new passport to replace the one confiscated during the war. But American media had created a narrative. Tokyo Rose was a traitor who had betrayed America. Someone needed to be held accountable. Public pressure mounted for prosecution. Celebrity columnist Walter Winchell led the media campaign against her. He portrayed her as the embodiment of Tokyo Rose. He ignored evidence of coercion and sabotage. He demanded she face trial for treason. The Justice Department reopened the investigation in 1948. Attorney General Tom Clark ordered her rearrested. She was brought to San Francisco to face trial. The trial began on July 5, 1949. It lasted 3 months. The prosecution's case was weak and based largely on witness testimony that was later proven to be coerced. The key prosecution witnesses were 2 Japanese-American men who testified that Toguri had made treasonous statements. Both later admitted they were threatened by American prosecutors. They were told they would be charged as war criminals if they didn't testify against Toguri. Their testimony was false, but the jury didn't know this at the time. The defense presented overwhelming evidence, testimony from Allied POWs that Toguri had been coerced, evidence that she maintained American citizenship despite pressure, documentation of her sabotage efforts, expert analysis showing her broadcasts were deliberately ineffective, but the jury was influenced by media coverage and public anger. Someone had to pay for Tokyo Rose. Toguri was available and convenient. On September 29, 1949, she was convicted on 1 count of treason. The count was based on allegedly making a treasonous statement about loss of American ships. She was acquitted on 7 other counts. On October 6, 1949, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined $10,000, the maximum sentence for the single count. The judge clearly intended to punish her severely, despite the weak evidence. She served 6 years and 2 months at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. She was released on January 28, 1956, for good behavior. After release, she lived quietly in Chicago. She ran her family's import business. She avoided all publicity. She never spoke about the trial or her wartime experiences, but she never stopped fighting to clear her name. Over the next 2 decades, she gathered evidence of her innocence. She collected testimony from former POWs confirming her sabotage. She documented the coerced testimony at her trial. She built an overwhelming case that she had been wrongfully convicted. Journalists began investigating her case in the 1970s. They discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. They found proof that key witnesses had been threatened. They documented that the FBI had known she was innocent, but prosecuted her anyway due to public pressure. A campaign to pardon her gained support. Veterans' organizations supported her pardon. Civil rights groups advocated for her. Journalists published evidence of her innocence. On January 19, 1977, his last full day in office, President Gerald Ford pardoned her. The pardon acknowledged she had been wrongfully convicted. It restored her civil rights. It officially recognized that she had been a scapegoat, not a traitor. Toguri died on September 26, 2006, at age 90 in Chicago. She never received a full apology from the U.S. government. She never received compensation for her 6 years of wrongful imprisonment. But she died knowing her name had been officially cleared. Her story reveals the profound injustice of the Tokyo Rose prosecution. She was punished for propaganda that had backfired against Japan. She was convicted of treason for broadcasts that had boosted American morale. She was imprisoned for sabotage that American authorities later acknowledged. The real tragedy is that she was exactly what she claimed, an American patriot trapped in horrible circumstances who resisted in the only way available to her. The propaganda she broadcast was designed to fail and did fail. She helped ensure that failure through deliberate sabotage. And she was punished for it by the country she had remained loyal to throughout the war. Her legacy is complex. To some, she remains a symbol of wartime collaboration. To others, she's a symbol of injustice and scapegoating. To those who understand the full story, she's a symbol of resistance and courage under impossible circumstances. But one thing is certain: the propaganda she broadcast backfired completely. Tokyo Rose, in all her incarnations, became a morale booster for American troops. The broadcasts designed to demoralize instead entertained. The messages designed to break fighting spirit instead strengthened it. Japanese propaganda backfired, and Eva Toguri helped make sure it did. Her story reveals the human cost of propaganda warfare. She was caught between 2 countries, used by one, prosecuted by the other. Guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place when war started. But she was just one voice in Japan's propaganda apparatus. Hundreds of others participated willingly. They believed the propaganda they broadcast. They thought they were helping Japan win. After the war, many Japanese propagandists struggled with what they had done. They had lied to their own people. They had created false narratives that prolonged suffering. They had convinced civilians that victory was possible when defeat was certain. Some felt profound guilt. They had told mothers their sons died gloriously when they died pointlessly. They had told civilians America would be defeated when America was winning. They had sustained false hope that made eventual defeat more traumatic. Others rationalized their actions. They were following orders. They were serving their country. Propaganda was a legitimate tool of war, but few could deny the ultimate verdict. Japanese propaganda had failed. It hadn't demoralized the enemy. It had undermined Japanese morale instead. The voices that broadcast confidence couldn't hide the reality of defeat. The messages promising victory couldn't prevent firebombing. The propaganda designed to sustain the war effort had been overwhelmed by truth. Strategic impact. When propaganda meets reality. Measuring the strategic impact of failed propaganda is difficult. Propaganda's effectiveness can't be quantified like bombs dropped or ships sunk. But the consequences of Japan's propaganda failure were profound. First, Japanese military planning was distorted by their own propaganda. Commanders believed their own exaggerated reports of success. They made strategic decisions based on false information they had created. After the Battle of Midway, Japanese propaganda reported a great victory. Japanese military leadership began believing their own propaganda. They planned subsequent operations assuming Midway had been a success. These plans were based on fantasy, not reality. This created a feedback loop of failure. False reporting led to bad decisions. Bad decisions led to defeats. Defeats were falsely reported as victories. The cycle repeated. By 1945, Japanese military leadership had lost touch with reality. They believed their own propaganda about American weakness. They believed divine intervention would save Japan. They believed tactics that had failed repeatedly would somehow succeed. This extended the war unnecessarily. Leaders who understood reality might have sought peace earlier. Leaders who believed propaganda continued fighting long after defeat was inevitable. Second, domestic morale collapsed when reality became undeniable. Japanese propaganda had created expectations of victory. When defeat arrived, the psychological shock was extreme. If propaganda had been realistic, civilians might have been prepared. If they'd been told, the war will be difficult and we might lose, they could have processed defeat. But they were told, victory is certain and divine wind will protect us. When American bombers destroyed cities unopposed, the narrative shattered. Civilians realized they'd been lied to comprehensively. Trust in government and military collapsed. The morale crisis was worse than if propaganda had been honest. False hope, followed by crushing reality, is psychologically devastating. Realistic pessimism, followed by expected outcomes, is easier to bear. Third, Japanese prisoners became more willing to cooperate with American intelligence. Prisoners who discovered American abundance realized Japanese propaganda had lied. If propaganda lied about American weakness, what else was false? Disillusionment made prisoners more willing to provide intelligence. Why protect a government that had lied to you? Why maintain loyalty to leaders who sent you to die based on false information? American interrogators exploited this disillusionment. They would show Japanese prisoners American supply depots, mountains of food, equipment, ammunition. Then they'd ask, "Is this what Tokyo told you America had?" The contrast broke resistance. Prisoners who saw the truth became cooperative. Fourth, Allied psychological warfare became more effective. American propaganda could point to Japanese propaganda failures. Tokyo says they're winning. Look around. Does it look like they're winning? American leaflets dropped on Japanese positions were devastatingly effective. They didn't need to lie. They could tell the truth, and the truth was more demoralizing than any propaganda. Your government says Japan is winning, but American forces are 100 miles closer to Tokyo than last month. Who's lying? Japanese soldiers could verify American claims. They could see American advances. They could see Japanese retreats. American propaganda was credible because it was verifiable. Fifth, post-war Japanese society struggled with propaganda's legacy. An entire generation had been fed lies. They had believed in inevitable victory. They had believed in divine protection. They had believed America was weak and decadent. When reality proved otherwise, they had to rebuild their entire worldview. This created profound psychological trauma at a national level. The trauma affected how Japan processed the war. There was shame not just about losing, but about being deceived. Citizens felt betrayed by their own government. This contributed to post-war reforms. Japan's new constitution guaranteed free speech and press freedom. The reforms were designed to prevent propaganda from ever again deceiving the population. Sixth, the propaganda failure influenced the decision to surrender. By August 1945, Japanese leadership knew propaganda had failed. Civilians no longer believed official narratives. Soldiers were surrendering in increasing numbers. The social cohesion necessary to continue fighting was dissolving. When Emperor Hirohito decided to surrender, one factor was the collapse of domestic morale. Propaganda could no longer sustain the war effort. The lies had been exposed. Continued resistance was impossible when nobody believed the justification. The strategic verdict is clear. Japanese propaganda was not just ineffective, it was counterproductive. It didn't demoralize enemies, it entertained them. It didn't sustain domestic morale. It undermined it through false expectations. It didn't support military operations. It distorted planning through false reporting. Every goal of propaganda was not just unmet, but reversed. The propaganda designed to strengthen Japan weakened it. The messages designed to damage enemies amused them. The narrative designed to sustain the war effort hastened its end. Modern relevance. The limits of narrative control. Japan's propaganda failure offers lessons for modern information warfare. The core lesson: propaganda that contradicts easily verifiable reality will backfire. In the Internet age, this lesson is even more relevant. Information flows globally and instantly. Claims can be fact-checked in seconds. Lies are exposed faster than ever. Modern authoritarian governments face the same challenge Japan faced. They want to control the narrative. They want to shape how citizens perceive reality. But reality is increasingly difficult to hide. North Korea maintains elaborate propaganda about the outside world. Citizens are told North Korea is prosperous and the West is collapsing. But smuggled smartphones and USB drives bring outside information. When North Koreans see the truth, the propaganda collapses. The response is the same as Japan's after Midway. Double down on propaganda. Make claims even more extreme. Punish those who question the narrative. But this only delays the inevitable. Reality eventually intrudes. When it does, the psychological crash is severe. Russia's propaganda during the Ukraine invasion shows similar patterns. Official media claims Russia is winning decisively. But soldiers' phones and social media show heavy losses. Families receive bodies when propaganda claims victory. The disconnect creates the same crisis Japanese propaganda created. Citizens begin questioning everything. If the government lies about the war, what else is false? Modern democracies aren't immune to propaganda challenges. But democratic systems have a critical advantage: multiple information sources. When one source lies, others can expose it. This creates resilience against propaganda. The lesson from Japan: monoculture information environments are fragile. When everyone gets information from one source, that source controls reality. But when reality contradicts the source, the entire system collapses. Diverse information ecosystems are resilient. When one source is wrong, others compensate. People develop critical thinking skills from comparing sources. No single narrative can dominate completely. The Tokyo Rose phenomenon has modern equivalents. During the Iraq War, Iraqi propaganda broadcasts aimed at demoralizing American troops. The broadcasts failed for the same reason Tokyo Rose failed. American troops had alternative information sources and could verify claims. Terrorist organizations produce propaganda videos. The videos show strength and inevitability of victory, but reality shows their defeats. The propaganda can't overcome observable facts. The fundamental principle remains: propaganda works when it aligns with or shapes reality. Propaganda fails when reality obviously contradicts it. Japan's propaganda failed because reality was too visible. American troops could see they weren't weak or poorly supplied. Japanese civilians could see American bombers overhead. Japanese soldiers could see they were losing battles. No amount of propaganda could override direct observation. Modern propaganda faces the same constraint. You can't tell people they're prosperous when they're starving. You can't tell people they're winning when cities are being bombed. You can't tell people the enemy is weak when the enemy is obviously strong. The propaganda might work temporarily, but eventually reality wins. When it does, the backlash is severe. People who discover they've been lied to become immune to future propaganda. They develop permanent skepticism toward official narratives. They may reject even true statements from sources that previously lied. This is the ultimate propaganda backfire. Not just that specific claims fail, but that the entire propaganda apparatus loses credibility permanently. Japan experienced this. Post-war Japanese citizens were deeply skeptical of government pronouncements. They had been lied to so comprehensively during the war that they stopped trusting authority. This skepticism persists in Japanese culture today. There's a cultural awareness that official narratives can be completely false. This creates resistance to propaganda that didn't exist before the war. The modern lesson: short-term propaganda success can create long-term credibility destruction. If you lie now and are exposed later, you lose the ability to persuade in the future. Better to tell uncomfortable truths and maintain credibility than to tell comfortable lies that will be exposed. Conclusion: the propaganda that couldn't survive truth. Japanese propaganda during World War II was sophisticated, well-funded, and comprehensive. It employed talented writers, artists, and broadcasters. It utilized the latest technology and psychological techniques. It dominated all information channels in Japan, but it failed completely. Not because the production quality was poor, not because the distribution was inadequate, not because the personnel were incompetent. It failed because it was built on lies that reality could easily disprove. Tokyo Rose told American troops they were losing. American troops could see they were advancing. The propaganda was contradicted by observable facts. Japanese domestic propaganda claimed victory after victory. Japanese civilians saw their cities burning. The propaganda was contradicted by lived experience. Japanese military propaganda claimed American weakness. Japanese soldiers encountered American strength. The propaganda was contradicted by battlefield reality. Every propaganda claim was undermined by truth, and truth always wins eventually. The tragedy was the human cost. Eva Toguri was imprisoned for propaganda she had sabotaged. Japanese civilians were psychologically devastated when lies were exposed. Japanese soldiers fought on believing victory was possible when it wasn't. Millions suffered because propaganda created false expectations, false hopes that reality destroyed, false narratives that truth shattered. The legacy is a warning. Propaganda that contradicts reality will backfire. Lies that can be easily disproved undermine all future credibility. Narrative control that denies observable truth ultimately destroys itself. Japan's propaganda was designed to strengthen national resolve. It weakened it instead. It was designed to demoralize enemies. It entertained them instead. It was designed to support the war effort. It undermined it instead. Every goal was not just unmet, but reversed. The propaganda that was supposed to help Japan hastened its defeat. In the end, Tokyo Rose became a symbol of propaganda's limitations. Her broadcasts were supposed to break American morale. They became the highlight of American Troops Day. The music that was supposed to make them homesick gave them joy. The messages that were supposed to demoralize them made them laugh. The propaganda that was supposed to weaken them strengthened them. Complete and total backfire. The Japanese military never expected their own propaganda to fail so completely. They believed repetition and authority could overcome truth. They were wrong. Truth doesn't require repetition. It doesn't require authority. It requires only observation. And observation was available to everyone. American troops could see the reality of American strength. Japanese civilians could see the reality of Japanese defeat. Japanese soldiers could see the reality of American advancement. No propaganda could hide what people could see with their own eyes. The broadcasts continued until Japan surrendered. The leaflets kept falling until peace was signed. The propaganda machine ran until there was nothing left to propagandize. But the war was already lost. Lost not just militarily, but in the battle for truth. Because propaganda built on lies cannot survive contact with reality, and reality always makes contact eventually. Japan's propaganda failed because truth is stronger than lies. Simple, inevitable, complete. The propaganda that was supposed to save Japan helped destroy it. The voices that broadcast confidence couldn't hide defeat. The messages promising victory couldn't prevent firebombing. And Tokyo Rose, the most famous propaganda failure of all, became an icon, not of Japanese propaganda success, but of propaganda's fundamental weakness. When lies meet truth, truth wins. Always. Eventually. Completely. Japan's propaganda never expected to backfire. But backfire it did. Spectacularly. Completely. Permanently. The lesson echoes across history. Control the narrative if you can. But never forget that reality cannot be controlled. And when reality contradicts propaganda, reality wins. Every time. Without exception.